Like most European territories, Germany had been impacted by the events of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. With the advance of French forces across the continent, the old social and political structures of the Holy Roman Empire had been destroyed. The Napoleonic model of government and law was imposed on most German territories under French control. During the Napoleonic period, the over 200 states and principalities that made up the Holy Roman Empire were organized into a new Confederation of the Rhine, consisting of 36 states. Southern and Western Germany in particular were significantly transformed. Napoleon had enlarged the states on the French border, bringing into existence a ring of weak allies and client states that made up the outer core of the Napoleonic continental empire. The war years also stimulated powerful nationalist aspirations among German elites. New French ideas being imported from across the border played a part in this, but so too did resistance to Napoleonic imperialism. During the last years of French rule, as the Grande Armée retreated, the Prussian commander, Baron von Stein, encouraged nationalist resistance against Napoleon, calling upon true patriots to rise up and liberate the German fatherland from French oppression. These appeals and aspirations left high expectations after the war for the creation of a German nation. Yet this did not occur. The Congress of Vienna left the Napoleonic Confederation more or less intact. The post-Napoleonic Staatenbund was an assemblage of 37 principalities and 4 free cities. 21 of these principalities had populations under 100,000 people. Hopes of a post-war liberal and constitutional Germany were also frustrated. In many places, political institutions remained under the control of regional monarchs and the nobility, while electoral franchises were severely restricted. If the years of the French Revolution had stimulated desires for the creation of a modern German nation similar to France or Britain, what resulted was significantly different. Compared to modern nations, Germany appeared backward and medieval. It was an assemblage of kingdoms. Its political system remained aristocratic and illiberal, while its industrial capacities remained underdeveloped. In the post-war years, a collective sense of disillusion and even inferiority gripped German intellectuals. And yet, if German elites felt betrayed by this state of affairs, there was one area in which Germans were at the cultural forefront, and that was in the domain of philosophy. German philosophers were among the leading thinkers of the period. By 1815, French philosophes like Voltaire and Rousseau were beginning to appear outdated. Their ideas belonged to a pre-revolutionary world, while many German philosophers were promoting ideas applicable to the new realities of Romanticism and a post-revolutionary Europe. A general impression of Germany as a Land der Dichter und Denker, or land of poets and philosophers, was beginning to emerge, giving Germans a certain sense of pride and distinctiveness. As the poet Heinrich Heine would claim in 1844, the land is held by the Russians and French, the seas by the British invested, but in the airy realm of dreams, our sway is uncontested. Unquestionable leading figure of these new Deutsche Philosophen was the Rhenish philosopher Georg Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was representative of a new brand of philosophical idealism that was taking root in Germany by the early 19th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, he had been a lecturer at Jena, a city occupied by French forces. Hegel even got a glimpse of Napoleon during one of his military campaigns, when the emperor stopped in Jena, and he was immediately taken by the man, whom it is impossible not to admire, as he put it. The revolutionary atmosphere of the early 19th century would have a profound impact on Hegel's thinking. As an idealist, Hegel put a strong emphasis on the powers of human understanding and, above all, human reason. As he argued, reason is the soul of the world. It inhabits it, is immanent in it. For Hegel, reason and ideas were the primary forces in the world. They were what he called Geist, or spirit. What he meant by this was not simply ideas in the abstract, but ideas that drove human societies and human history. In essence, the power that ideas exercised in the real world and the relationship between ideas and society. As Hegel argued, the world was a representation of ideas. Simply put, the material world was a theater in which ideas played themselves out, and this premise became the basis for a conception of radical historical change that would define much of Hegel's thinking. More to the point, human development was not simply driven by ideas. It was driven by the struggle of competing ideas and concepts, what Hegel called the dialectic. Concepts begin with an affirmation or a thesis. However, this inevitably invites a negative concept of what it is not, or an antithesis. According to Hegel, this concept and its negation would enter into struggle and eventually combine into a higher unification, what he called a synthesis. This synthesis became in turn a new thesis, which produced its own antithesis, starting the process over again. While this Hegelian model of change appeared abstract, it was, in many respects, derived from the experience of the French Revolution. The Revolution had marked a world historical point of change, and it was this process of change and competing ideas that Hegel was interested in. The feudal dynastic society of the old regime had served to produce its opposite, the Enlightenment, a movement that promoted concepts of natural right and freedom, contrary to royal privilege and patriarchy. These two concepts had violently waged war against one another, resulting in the French Revolution. However, this struggle had eventually reconciled itself in a new synthesis, a state in which the two aspects were combined and transformed into a higher combination. For Hegel, this was Napoleon, with his mix of revolutionary and absolutist elements. Napoleon was the embodiment of the world's spirit, the Weltgeist, at the dawn of the 19th century. And this interpretation explains why Hegel was in such awe of the man. For Hegel, Napoleon was the embodiment of historical forces, the world's spirit incarnate. In general, the dialectic offered an explanatory model for violent historical change and progress. It made sense of large historical and social conflicts, like the French Revolution, and marked them as moments in the advancement of human progress. As Hegel believed, man continued onward through higher and higher combinations, striving toward the end goal, or the absolute idea of pure reason. Hegelian ideas came to play a dominant role in German universities in the 19th century, and it would be at one of these universities that a young philosophy student would begin to apply Hegel in a new and very different way, producing one of the most influential movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Karl Marx was the son of a Rhineland barrister and assimilated Jew, who wished above all for his son to take up a legal profession. However, at university, the young Marx showed little inclination to follow in his father's footsteps. In fact, he showed little inclination to do much serious studying at all. He joined poetry and tavern clubs, took up gambling and drinking with cohorts, and even showed a taste for dueling, which was fashionable among young German elites of the day. His indiscretions became so troubling that he was eventually compelled to leave the university in Bonn and pursue his studies in Berlin, a university known for its rigor and discipline. In addition to its notoriously strict rules, the study of Hegelian philosophy was strongly entrenched in the Berlin curriculum, and it was there that Marx took to studying philosophy. While it was not law, as his father had hoped, it was better than the drunken carousing he had become known for in Bonn. In a complete 180, the young Marx became an ideal student. He was infamous for staying up late at night to read and write, even working himself to the point of exhaustion. The intellectual atmosphere in Berlin at this time was also stimulating. During the late 1830s, a new movement was taking root, the so-called Young Hegelians, who began using materialist philosophy to attack Christianity and promote certain radical ideas of society. Marx joined a Young Hegelian club, but he soon found he was not necessarily in agreement with their aims. Marx was coming to believe that philosophers were too abstract. They were concerned with purely ethical and moral questions for their own sake, but these lacked any real application in the world. As Marx was coming to see it, purely academic questions were not enough. To this end, he began criticizing his cohorts. He called for a philosophy that could understand man in his time and social environment, rather than abstract theorizing. As he would famously declare, philosophers up until the present have sought to understand the world. The point is to change it. This new insistence on a more active philosophy was inspired in part by Marx's job as a journalist. After leaving university, he took up editing a paper in Cologne, and through this became familiar with the economic hardships faced by peasant farmers and wine growers in the region. In defending their interests in his paper, Marx also became familiar with the censorship of the Prussian government, and he began criticizing this as well. Within 5 months of Marx becoming editor, the paper was shut down. In many ways, Marx considered it a blessing in disguise. Journalism had taken up a great deal of his time. Now, he would be free to study questions that interested him. Marx had not been a full-blown socialist at this time. He was concerned with certain social and political questions, but he did not necessarily prescribe to a socialist doctrine by any means. This, however, was going to shortly change. In 1843, Marx moved to Paris, where he took up a job as a co-editor for a new leftist German émigré newspaper. State censorship was forcing German publishers to move abroad, and by the 1840s, places like London and Paris were becoming havens for foreign exiles and radical editors of all kinds. In Paris, Marx became directly exposed to French socialism. He made contacts with communist secret societies, most notably the so-called League of the Just, inspired by the ideas of Gracchus Babeuf. He also met with various German workers and exiles, who were beginning to form German worker movements in the French capital. He attended worker meetings and came to know the leaders organizing protest movements. In short, Paris offered Marx a new world, and in socializing and collaborating with these groups, Marx began to speak more openly about worker issues. class struggle and revolutionary programs began to fill his writings as he began studying socialism and reflecting seriously upon its revolutionary potentials. Yet Marx came at these issues from a different perspective than his French counterparts. French radicals typically placed their hopes in political revolt. They plotted Jacobin-style coups aimed at decapitating the state and creating a more just and equal society. Marx, though, was skeptical of such an approach. As a philosopher who had begun studying economic and social issues, Marx believed that Jacobin-style revolution was futile if the conditions for revolution were not in place first. He was coming to understand that revolution could not only be political, it had to be a social revolution as well. Revolution was not simply about overthrowing the government or dictating laws. It was about transforming society and social relationships. Revolutionaries needed a deeper appreciation for the social forces at play, in Marx's opinion, and this was precisely what French radicals lacked. In fact, Marx went as far as to claim that the reign of terror had occurred because the conditions for a real social revolution had not yet been in place. The Jacobins had been forced to impose their policies through violence rather than implement them with broad support. And this would certainly happen again, by simply trying to decapitate the state without laying the groundwork first. According to Marx, what was laying the groundwork for this social revolution was industrialization and the particular forms of social inequality and misery that it generated. And in this opinion, Marx found a sympathizer in a fellow German communist, Friedrich Engels. Engels and Marx had been contributing to many of the same German newspapers during the early 1840s, and in doing so, had come to know one another. Engels' family had made a small fortune in textile manufacturing over the years, and owned a firm with branches in both Germany and Manchester, England. Working briefly at the Manchester branch, Engels became acquainted with the growing labor discontent roiling the country, and soon became convinced of the miseries created by industry. During his near 2-year stay in England, Engels committed himself to a serious study of working conditions in the country and took a special interest in the Chartist movement that had begun to attract a mass following. From these observations, he came to recognize that class antagonism was completely changing modern politics. The Chartists, with their mass rallies and petitioning, were sheer proof of this assumption. In the coming years, Marx and Engels began to work closely together, sharing a belief in the problems generated by modernization and the necessity of worker revolution to correct them. The two men were in many ways complementary. Marx saw the working class in broad, abstract terms. For him, the proletariat was the product of larger social and economic changes occurring in the modern world. In essence, modernization had produced the proletariat, creating a new class unparalleled in history. Engels took these abstractions and put them in the real context of misery and factory life. These were the details that would ultimately authenticate Marx's ideas. It didn't hurt that Engels came from a prosperous family and had a source of funds that the two could draw on to promote their ideas. While socialism had initially been a French idea, Marx and Engels would put forward a new type of socialism, one that claimed to be scientific and grounded in an appreciation for social and economic realities. In their opinion, men like Saint-Simon or Fourier were hopelessly utopian. If they believed that an idealistic social harmony was possible between workers and capitalists, they did not understand the true nature of capitalism or social development, Marx charged. For Marx, capital and industrialization was dependent upon oppressing workers. Marx agreed with the theories of leading economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who insisted that wealth was made up of both labor and production. Yet Marx argued that while the workers produced, they did not receive the benefits of this production. Production benefited the new class of capitalists and entrepreneurs who owned the machines and factories where work took place, what Marx would label the means of production. And this was a key point in understanding not just capitalism, but human societies in general. Control of resources and productive capabilities were the linchpin of social power. In outlining his theories, Marx drew upon his former Hegelian education. He believed in historical dialecticism. However, he felt Hegel's ideas of historical change were too abstract. Marx didn't want to apply Hegel. He wanted to turn him on his head, as he famously claimed. And this meant looking at historical change not in terms of ideas, but in terms of real material realities and economic change over time. This assessment would provide the basis for what Marx deemed a materialist vision of history, one that saw human society and its evolution in terms of economic productivity, labor, and the social relations that resulted from them. In examining how social and economic forces came to influence change, Marx was coming to agree with liberal historians who argued that class struggle was central to modern society. In fact, he would press this idea further. Struggle was not only central to modern society, but human existence in general. And in this view, this class struggle was also the motor of revolutionary social change. Over time, oppressed classes would become aware of their exploitation, and once they realized this, they would become what Marx called class conscious, meaning they would recognize themselves as a specific social group that was under the yoke of another social group. This realization would inevitably encourage resistance, compelling them to rise up and overthrow the existing order. In doing so, the oppressed would attempt to establish a new social order that conformed to their own interests and outlooks. In Marx's assessment, the French Revolution had marked the moment in which the bourgeoisie had risen up to cast off the aristocracy. In turn, it was now going to be the workers who would rise up and overthrow their bourgeois oppressors. Marx was adamant that this change could not be achieved through peaceful means. The wealth of the bourgeoisie was dependent upon exploiting the working classes and dominating the means of production. Therefore, they would fight tooth and nail to keep workers in a state of subservience. In this respect, a worker revolution was necessary, one that would seize control of the state and seek to create a classless and equal society. Yet for all his revolutionary rhetoric, Marx did not support a reckless revolutionary adventurism. It was through spreading propaganda and organization that the groundwork for the revolution would be secured. Above all, Marx was convinced that the workers could not rely on bourgeois parties to fight on their behalf. Workers needed to ensure that there existed bodies that they controlled and which spoke for them. To this end, Marx and Engels worked to organize communists and radicals across state and national boundaries. In 1846, they took the initiative in founding a network of communist correspondence committees with the intention of keeping German, French, and British socialists informed of each other's ideas and activities. The following year, the two were instrumental in transforming the League of the Just into an enlarged communist league. Unlike its predecessor, which had been conspiratorial and underground, Marx envisioned the new league as a more open and democratic organization. It would hold annual congresses, during which all members would vote on policies and appoint their leaders. These efforts at organization proved invariably tricky and typically resulted in feuds over the proper methods of carrying out a communist revolution. More radical members tended to favor immediate insurrection and political revolt. However, Marx clung to his belief in patience and proper timing. These arguments often became heated, revealing the very fragile nature of worker movements at the time. Moreover, the question of when and how to strike was never fully resolved and would remain a constant point of contention. To smooth over some of these tensions, it was believed the new Communist League required a clear profession of its goals and beliefs. This would provide a central document for the organization, giving it a public identity and policy statement. This responsibility fell to Marx and Engels, who began drafting the work in late 1847. By January of 1848, the work was finished and sent to London to be published. The title said it all: The Manifesto of the Communist Party, a short and concise pamphlet that neatly summarized Marx's ideas on historical materialism and worker revolution. The timing of its publication was also fortuitous. When it appeared in press, the document was hardly read outside of a small circle of communist organizers and activists. However, it appeared at a moment when social tensions across the continent were reaching a fever pitch. As the pamphlet came off the presses, events in France were beginning to indicate that Marx's prophesizing might in fact be accurate. That month, protests and street demonstrations brought down the government of Louis Philippe, generating a wave of radicalism that would ripple across the continent over the next year. Through chance, Marx and Engels' revolutionary manifesto now found a revolutionary environment, one that it had not necessarily created, but which it could certainly seek to influence.